Hi everyone, welcome to this week's recitation video. We're going to be working on JavaScript loops and arrays, and also happy Halloween. So a couple of things before we get started. You do have a functions quiz due this week, and your assignment A on arrays and loops is going to be due November 10th, so that's not at the end of this week. You have an extra week for that, so just keep that in mind. I also will not be having my camera turned on today just because I don't feel so well, so we're just going to continue the rest of the video like this, and hopefully it goes back to normal for next week's video. Okay, so let's get started. So what is an array? So it's basically a data structure that holds multiple values inside a single variable. So things like a list of fruits or a list of student names, maybe the list of student grades from a certain class. Those could all be examples of what could be stored in an array. So here, look at this example, just assume we use the keyword var to initialize, not let. So var fruits is equal to, and in brackets, you're going to have your list of values that are separated by commas. And the main thing to remember when you have an array is that the length is going to be different from the index number. So if you literally count the number of boxes you have, or values you have in this array, there's 5 boxes, so the length is 5. But the index is going to be different. The index is going to start at 0 and go from there. So it's always going to be like 1 less than the actual length. So you want to keep that in mind later when you're working with arrays, because you don't want to get this common error called index out of bounds, where you're trying to access an index, like let's say you're trying to access the 5th element and you call index 5 because you want the 5th one. That's not going to work because this is actually index 4. Index 5 doesn't actually exist. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, and what is a loop? So a loop is a way to print out a block of code repeatedly as long as a condition is true. And there's different types. There's a for loop, a while loop, a do while loop, but for now we're just going to be focusing on for loops. So if you look at this little picture over here, you're going to you're going to create the loop using the keyword for, and then you're going to have 3 different things inside the parentheses. So the first one is the initialization. We're going to be using var I is equal to 0. So that should be very similar from past JavaScript videos. That's just initializing variable. And here we're calling it I. It's very common in programming to use the variable I. For no particular reason, it's just everyone tends to use I when creating a for loop. So var I is equal to 0. I is less than 10, I++. So you have initialization, a condition, and then an updater. So this condition means that you want this loop to execute this line of code only while the value of I is less than 10. Because every time it executes, it's going to increment by 1. So that's what I++ means. It's going to go up by 1. So let's say it starts at 0. 0 is less than 10. Okay, you do this console.log I. That just means you're displaying the value of I into the console. Or you don't have to exactly know this line. We're going to be using a different type of line to display the value of I. So now they're going to just display 0 because that's what it is. And once it does that, it's going to update the value of I. So now it's going to be 1 because I++, you add 1 to 0, it becomes 1. Now, 1 is less than 10 still, so now you display the value of I, which is 1. Now you go on to 2, and you do so on all the way until you get to 9. So 9 is less than 10, so you display 9, but then when you update it, you get I is equal to 10. So 10 is not less than 10. So that's where this for loop would just stop executing. Once this condition turns false, it stops executing. Same thing would happen here. You would just print out the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. You would stop because 5 would not print out because 5 is not less than 5. Okay, so that's it for the slides. We're just going to jump into the code. So this file, recitation 9 array basics initial.html, should be posted in the recitation files for recitation 9. And a couple things I just wanted to go over. There's this like handy little trick if you want to do, but I think it's only for Sublime, but you can try later if you use VS Code. But if you type in HTML and you press the tab button, it gives you the whole basic shell HTML instead of you having to type it out. So just for your future reference. Okay, but this file is just like an array basics file. We're going to have a bunch of functions and a bunch of code to display. So right now we've given most of the code for you, and we're just going to fill in the blanks kind of. So if you open this in the browser, it's going to show up like this. Not much, it's just a bunch of text. We're going to fill in this function that's going to print array values in order, print them in a reverse order, find the average, find the largest index. I'm going to go over this in 2 seconds. And then here you're just going to call the methods that we just wrote. And then you're also going to find the average of array values, finding where the largest number is in the books array. And then this is going to be the last part where you print a bar graph. So that's going to be a nested loop. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over is how they created their arrays. So they'd used var, and they named their array, they named it names, is equal to new, so you're going to need this, the new keyword, and then the word array. So inside this, you're just going to put in everything inside your array. Okay. And then if you want to create an array of two-digit integers, but you don't know what exact integers you want, you can just create an array by just giving it a size and then update it later. So that's what they're doing over here. Var books is equal to new array, and then in parentheses they have 10. So that just means the size of the array is going to be 10. Now, to actually update it, they're creating a for loop, and they're going to populate the arrays. Like, that's the term we use. So for var I is equal to 0, initialization, I is less than 10, condition, I++, updated. So while I is basically less than 10, you're going to execute these pieces of code. So we're creating a variable called rand, and we're calling 2 different functions on it. And this is where it gets a little confusing, so you might have to do some practice on your own. We're going to be using math.random. So math.random gives you a random number between values that you specify. And the values that you specify can be a little bit tricky. So if you look over here, usually math.floor and math.random are used together. Math.floor is mainly for rounding down to the nearest integer. So let's say if you had a number like 5.6, if you use math.floor on that number, it's going to round down to the lower number, like 5. It's not going to do our general rounding up values. Okay, so let's say you want a random integer from 0 to 9. You're going to basically put math.floor, and then inside put math.random, and then multiply by 10. So notice how it is exclusive. It's not going to include the number 10. It's just going to go straight from 0 to 9. Now you might be wondering, like, okay, well, we never specified 0, then how does it know where to start? It's automatically going to start from 0 if you don't specify. Okay. And, if you want 0 to 10, then you would put times 11. And same thing goes on. Now, let's say you want a starting value. Then you would add that value after. So here, it's going from 10 to 90. Okay. And then books of I is equal to rand. So what that's doing is it's taking the value that you get into rand. So, you do all this calculation, you put that number in rand. Now, whatever's in rand, you're going to put it into the value of books of I. So that just means the value of I, or that index position in the books array that you created. So let's say the first random number that you get is like 5. Or sorry, the first number you get might be like 20. 20 is stored in this rand variable. it's still here in this rand variable. And now 20 is going to be in the first number in the 2-digit integers array called books that we created, because it's going to be books of, what's the value of I right now? It's 0, and that's going to be equal to 20. Okay, so I'm hoping that makes a little bit of sense. If you don't understand math.random and math.floor, I highly suggest you go to W3 Schools and do some practice and some research on your own. But for now, we're going to move on. So we're going to print the array values in order. So they created a function for us, and we're going to be using document.write to display basically the array values in order. Okay, so I'm just going to copy paste the code that I already have, and I'm going to explain line by line. Okay, so they already gave you the function, how to create it. We just had to input the code in the inside. So we're going to create a for loop. And to print the values in order, notice how they say in order, because later we're going to do reverse order. To do it in order, you have to start at the beginning and go one by one all the way until the end. But the way you do it is you have to follow the index numbers. And you know the index numbers is actually kind of different from the length, because we talked about that before. So we're going to start at I is equal to 0, and we're going to go if I is equal or less than a.length. What is a? A is this parameter. So later we're going to call this method, and we're going to actually put an array inside of there. And that's what this a is referring to. So whatever array the user gives us, we're going to be using that length. So let's say we made an array with the length of 20. It's going to go until I is less than 20, which means I has to be 19 at the most. It can't become 20 because, it's not going to execute. And then I++. And document.write a of I. So that means in the array A, index position I. So if you want to print out the first element of an array, you would put a of 0, because the first index number is going to be 0. And here we're doing this thing called concatenation. So we're adding, or we're using the plus sign, it's not really adding, and we're putting it together with a space. That's why there's nothing inside of here, because we're just putting a space. So it's going to print out a bunch of numbers and then a space. And then here is just putting in some break tags, and it's going to give us a little bit extra space before we display the next one. Okay, so now let's say you wanted to print the array values in reverse order. So I want you guys to think about it for a second. In normal everyday life, how do you do things in reverse? You start all the way at the end and you go back to the beginning. So in an array, what's all the way at the end? How do we access what's all the way at the end? We would do a.length. So we're going to start at a.length, and we're going to go all the way till the index number is not equal to 0. And then here we're going to be subtracting. So I'm just going to copy paste this function and put it over here. So you can also write this code at the same time on your own. Okay. So I created a for loop. Let's just index this a little bit. Okay. Var I is equal to a.length minus 1. So now why do we have the minus 1? That's important because let's say you had the length of your array was to be 20, right? If you do var I is equal to 20, you can't access the 20th index, because notice how the last index is going to be one less than the actual length value. So if you had an array of 20 values inside of it, your last index would be 19. So that's why we're doing a.length minus 1. So var would actually be equal to 1 less than the length, which is referring to the index number of the last value. So while you're at the end of the array and you're still greater than the first index number, you're going to subtract 1 by 1 by 1. So let's start out, let's say 20 in our example before. A of 20, a of 20 minus 1 is 19. So a of 19 would be whatever value you have in the last 19th position. You would display that, you put a space, and then it would go again up here at the top. And then after the whole for loop's done, it's going to give a break for the next line. Okay, now find average function. Finds and returns the average of the array values. So I want you guys to take a second and think about how do you make or like calculate the average or something. Well, the first thing you want to do is find the total and divide it by how many actual values you have. So how do you find the total? Well, first you got to count everything in the total. So for that, we can use prints the array values in order. We can use this method because we are traversing through this array. That means we're going one by one by one. And what we can do is instead of just displaying it, we can add the values all up together. So that's going to look something like this. So I'm creating a variable called sum. I'm doing that beforehand because I'm going to be using it later. Right now sum is set to 0 because we didn't, add anything to it yet. Now look at this for loop. It's the same thing as what we did in the beginning. It's just starting at 0, and as long as it's less than the length, it's incrementing. Now, inside each iteration, sum is equal to sum plus a of I. That's the same thing as saying sum plus equal a of I. So you can do both notations. I'm just adding a comment here. You can do both notations. They both mean that you're going to add whatever the value is at that index into this variable sum. So let's say you have let's say right now the value of array A is equal to 5, 2, 3, 4. Let's just say that for now. So right now this is index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3. So it stops at index 3 even though there is a length of 4. So now it's going to traverse through the array one by one. So now what is a of 0? A of 0 is 5. Sum is right now it's just 0. So 0 plus 5 is just equal to 5. And then it's going to go back up to the top. Now it's like, okay, let's go to the next index. Well, the value at the next index is 2. So now it's going to put in a 2 in here. And we already know the sum is 5. 5 plus 2 is 7. And it's going to do that again and again until it reaches the last index. And then we're going to create a variable called average. Var average is equal to sum divided a.length. So this total divided by how many actual values we have. So that should be like basic algebra. And then you just return the average. So here we're using the return keyword instead of just displaying it because we're going to be calling this function later to do that. Okay, next one. This recitation is basically just working on a bunch of different methods or functions using arrays and loops. So if you want to pause and try this on your own before I do it, or at least write some pseudocode or something like that, that would be very helpful for you. Okay, so function find largest index finds and returns the index of the largest element in the array. So how would you find the largest element in the array? Well, if you think about it, you would have to traverse through the whole array first to figure out what's even there. And then you got to start comparing one by one. And to compare one by one, you're going to need a for loop, and then you're going to need some code that does the comparing inside of it. And then once you find the biggest one, you want to store that in like a variable and return that variable. So here is the code for that function. And then we're going to break it down. Also, I just like when the curly braces are all at the beginning. They don't have to be like that. I just think it looks nice. But okay, so we're creating two variables here. Var large is equal to array of position 0. Okay. And var large position is equal to just 0. So that's just two variables we created. Now we're going through a loop. This is our simple loop, the one we first started. It's going from start to end. Now, here we have the if statement. This is going to do the actual comparing. If r of I, or the first, or the position at the R array, R is just the name of an array. If it's greater than the value of large, then you're going to put that bigger value inside of large, and you're going to put the index of wherever you found this bigger value into a position. So the index or the position, those should be like similar terms. And then once you do that, you're just going to return large position, because you want to return the index of the largest element of the array. You're not returning the actual largest element in the array. Okay. And that would be basically that. And this is something that we already went over. Now, let's say you want to actually call the methods or the functions that we just made. So it says call print array with books as an argument, call print array with names as argument, call print reverse with books as an argument, and with names as argument. So that is going to be very similar to what we did before. You're just going to put the function name, and then in parentheses, you're going to put the variable as the argument. So that is going to look like this. So print array R, print array names, print reverse R, print reverse names. Okay. And let's keep going. We have about 3 more things left to do. So finding average of array values, assign to the variable average the result of calling find average with books as the argument. Okay. Hold on. Okay, so when you're finding the average of the array values, you're just going to print out, so we already made the method find average, and then we're just going to put in a argument inside of it, and we're going to print it out nicely. So we're like putting in a string saying the average of the books owned in the array is, we're concatenating it with the method call, and then we just put a break. So notice we already made this method find average up here, and we're just calling it later down here. Okay, now finding where the largest number is in the books array. So that is also going to be very similar. We're going to create a variable called where, and we're going to assign the value that goes into where. That's going to be the result of this method call find largest index R. So once we find the largest index in this R array, we're going to put it into this variable called where, and then we're going to create this variable called largest, and it's going to hold the value of R of where. So that it's going to hold R of the index of where the largest number is. So that's why it's called largest. And then var who is equal to names of where. So in this variable called who, we're putting the value of this array inside the array names. We're putting the where index. So remember, where was the largest index number? Well, we're associating the corresponding position in the names array, and we're putting it into this who variable. And then we're just printing it out. So the largest number of books owned is 57, or whatever number it is. And then Sally owns the most books. So that would just be how you would display it. And the last one, the nested for loop to print the bar graph by values in the number array. That is going to look like this. So, we're just displaying a little line about the bar graph, and we're going to have this thing called a nested for loop. So in this nested for loop, what's happening is for every iteration that happens here, you're going to complete this for loop. So var I is equal to 0, I is less than r dot length, I plus plus. So that's just normal traversing through the array from start to end. And every time you do that, you want to display the names index. So we're going to display each person's name starting from the beginning, and then the value in the array r. And then we're going to display a star for every value there is in r. So let's say the Sally owned 20 books. Now we're going to create a for loop called star, or we're going to create a for loop with the variable star is equal to 0, star is less than 20 because that's the number of books she owned, star plus plus. And for every time it iterates, it's going to print out the star. And how many times it's going to print out? 20 times, because it's going from 0 all the way to 19, because star has to be less than 20. But 0 to 19 is still 20 stars. And then it's going to do a break. And then it's going to go to the next person. So it's going to go to the next array index, find the next person's name, how many books they owned, and print out the stars accordingly. So now, when you run this, it should open up something like this. So these are the number of books, the little loop we wrote for that, and these are the stars. So if Joey had 77 books, it print out 77 stars, and so on for all the people in our names array. Okay, and that should be it for this recitation. If you want some other tasks, you can do things like find the smallest number in an array, make your own array and find the smallest number, or any type of other calculation that helps you get practice. But that's it for now. Have a good week, and let me know if you have any questions. Bye!